To finish this section, let's quickly talk about timers in JavaScript. And we have two kinds of timers. First, the setTimeout timer runs just once after a defined time, while the setInterval timer keeps running basically forever until we stop it. So basically, we can use setTimeout to execute some code at some point in the future. So let's use this to simulate ordering a pizza. So when we order a pizza, it doesn't arrive right away, right? So instead, it's going to take some time, and we can simulate that. So let's write setTimeout, and then this function receives a callback function. So just like some array methods or DOM event handlers, right? And we already talked a lot about this, and I think we even used the setTimeout function here as an example of callback functions a bit earlier, right? So let's use an arrow function this time, actually, because why not? And so here, let's just say, here is your pizza. And then just some pizza emoji here, maybe. All right. So this callback function here is the first argument of the setTimeout function. And so again, we do not call this function ourselves. We simply pass in this function as an argument to setTimeout. And it is this function who will then call our callback function in the future. And when does that future arrive? Well, that's what we specify here in the second argument. So here we pass in the amount of milliseconds that will pass until this function is called. So let's say we want to call this function after 3 seconds, and so we need to pass 3000. So 1 second is 1000 milliseconds, and so this is basically 3 times 1000. Okay, so let's give it a save, and you see the page reloaded. And now, after 3 seconds have passed, we get this log to the console. Okay, and so with this, we really delayed calling this function here, right, by exactly 3 seconds. And we can also say that we schedule this function call for 3 seconds later. All right. Now, what's really important to realize here is that the code execution does not stop here at this point. All right. So when the execution of our code reaches this point, it will simply call the setTimeout function. It will then essentially register this callback function here to be called later, and then the code execution simply continues. And we can prove that by doing something after the setTimeout. So let's say waiting. And if we now save this, then immediately we will see this waiting in the console. So let's check that. And indeed, we get waiting. And then after the 3 seconds, then this log here appeared. All right. So this is really important to understand. So again, as soon as JavaScript hits this line of code here, it will simply basically keep counting the time in the background and register this callback function to be called after that time has elapsed. And then immediately JavaScript will move on to the next line, which is this one. All right. And this mechanism is called asynchronous JavaScript. And we will talk about how exactly all of this works behind the scenes in a special section just about asynchronous JavaScript. Okay. But anyway, what if we now needed to pass some arguments into this function here? It's not that simple, right? Because we are not calling this function ourselves. So we are not using the parentheses like this, and so therefore we cannot pass in any arguments into the function. Right? Now, however, the setTimeout function here actually has a solution for that. And it works like this. So basically all the arguments here that we pass after the delay will be arguments to the function. So let me demonstrate that to you. So let's say here olives, and then another argument spinach. And so here I can now specify the ingredients. So olives and spinach will be ingredients in our pizza. So let's say ingredient 1 and ingredient 2. And here we can then use them somehow. Let's make this a template literal. Let's give it a save here. And so the waiting once again appeared immediately. And then after 3 seconds, our string appeared locked to the console. And indeed, this third argument that we passed in did now become the first argument or the first parameter of our function here. And then the fourth argument became this second one. And if we passed in even more, we could then get access to them here in this callback function. All right. And that is essentially how the setTimeout function here works. There's just one more detail that I want to show you, which is the fact that we can actually cancel the timer at least until the delay has actually passed. So before these 3 seconds here have passed, we can cancel the timeout. And so let me show you how. Now to build this example, I first want to change something here. So I want to put the ingredients into an array. So let's say, again, olives and spinach. And so how would we then pass in these ingredients here? We're not going to do ingredients 0 and ingredients 1 like this, right? No. Instead, we will spread the array here using the spread operator. And so this will then take the elements out of the array and put them here basically comma separated. And so this now works exactly the same. But now what I want to do here is to say that if the ingredients include spinach, because that's something that many people don't like. So if the ingredients include spinach, then clear timeout. And so now here we need to pass in the name of the timer. And so we can basically assign this timer to a variable. So let's say simply, let's say pizza timer. And so here we can then use that variable, so that timer, to clear it. All right. So again, here we basically stored the result of the setTimeout function, which is essentially the timer. And then we can use that variable to clear the timeout. And then we can use that variable to basically delete the timer. And for that, we use clear timeout. And so now, since this array contains this spinach here, now you will not see the pizza string here printed to the console. All right. But if it did not include spinach, then of course, it would still work after 3 seconds. All right. So this is how the setTimeout function works. And that's actually it. That's all you need to know about the setTimeout function. It's pretty straightforward, right? So let's now actually go back to our application and implement a timer to simulate the approval of our loan. Okay. So when we click this button here to request a loan, then we get the value immediately right now. But typically a bank takes some time, like some days or some weeks, to approve that loan. And so let's simulate that here by taking like 2 or 3 seconds. So what happens when we successfully request a loan is essentially this code here, right? And so let's simply wrap all this code into a function. So curly braces, then function just like this, and then put all of this into a setTimeout. And then down here, give it a save, and then it should be nicely formatted. Okay, and now let's say, well, after 2.5 seconds. Okay, and so let's just see what it looks like in practice. So requesting a loan of 1,000. And so now it's going to take 2.5 seconds. And indeed, the bank just approved my loan here. So that was 10,000. Let's do something else. So count the seconds here. And now my loan was approved. And so then it appeared here in the movements, and it also appeared here in the balance. You saw that? So that makes our application a little bit more realistic. But let's go back now, because we also need to talk about setInterval. So we learned that setTimeout here simply schedules a function to run after a certain amount of time. But the callback function is only executed once. Now, what if we wanted to run a function over and over again, like every 5 seconds or every 10 minutes? Well, for that, we have the setTimeout function. So this one is going to be setTimeout. So let's use the setTimeout function to basically create a clock that will display in our console. So setTimeout, and then a function. And of course, I could have used an arrow function, but it doesn't really matter here. So our callback function, and let's create a new date here. So let's say now, and then new date. Okay, so this is nothing new at this point. And then let's just log that date, so that current date, to the console. And we want to execute this every 1 second. And so here we say 1 second. So let's see what happens. And indeed, once every second now, this should be executed. But it doesn't. And that's because I made the mistake of calling setTimeout again. But of course, as I was saying all the time, this one is actually called setInterval. So maybe you were already spotting this mistake, but now let's see what happens. So now, after each second here, we get the current time displayed to the console. So what's happening here is that this callback function is now executing every second. Okay? So every second a new date is created here and is then logged to the console. And of course, we could also say every 3 seconds. And then we would get the current time on the console every 3 seconds. You see? So it's adding 3 seconds each time now. But 1 second here makes a little bit more sense. Now, of course, you could print a real clock using this function now. Like you could get the current hour, minutes, and seconds from this now date. And so I would challenge you to do that actually, to take a minute or two in order to build like a real clock that is only logging the hours, minutes, and seconds here to the console. Now, I'm not going to do that here, but I think this would be a nice challenge to train a little bit the stuff that we've been using previously in the section. But for now, this is actually enough for this video. So take this challenge that I just mentioned, and then I'll see you soon in the next video.